There are a couple of really important things that we need to look at and talk about before we even get to that, though. And I think one of them that is very important for me as a First Nations person standing here today is to acknowledge the traditional territory that I'm on, the traditional territory of the Kumeyaay and Degwenos people of this area, people who have lived here for time immemorial, who we're guests on their land today, and honored to be here, to be able to chat with you guys and share what I have to say, what other folks have to say. Before we can jump into a conversation around 21st century higher education, Indigenous ways of knowing and doing across the academy, we really need to stop for a second and look back and reflect on another way of knowing and doing, on another way of understanding. We need to take a look at 19th, 20th century ways of knowing, education, background, colonization, civilization, all of those pieces. Why are we at a point today where we need to consider these things? Why are we at a point that we need to look at the idea of what Indigenous ways of knowing and doing might be in an academic setting? Why do we see poverty in Indigenous communities across the globe? Why do we see our jails and prisons filled up with a much higher percentage of Indigenous people? Why do we see people sitting at a lower economic and educational standpoint than what their neighbors are at? So really, why is it that we need to consider looking at, acknowledging, and living Indigenous ways of knowing and doing in our post-secondary higher educational institutions? If we go back and we look at when the continent was being settled, when we started to see newcomers arriving into this area, we started to see a lot of controls being placed on the Indigenous populations. We started to see their ways of life being changed. We started to see the dismantling, the systemic dismantling of language, of culture, of values, of societal structures. We eventually saw the implementation of the residential school system. In Canada, this was a huge part of our story and history. In the States, there is a similar piece, and when we look at many different colonized civilizations around the globe, we see very similar pieces to that. We saw children forcefully removed from their families and their homes and brought into an educational institution, an academy of sorts. In Canada, based on a lot of different pieces, but when we look at this quote on the screen, if anything is to be done with the Indian, we must catch him very young. We must keep him constantly within the circle of civilized conditions. This was something that led to that political landscape. This is something that led to that legislative base. And when we look at those conditions that Indigenous people are sitting in, when we look at that disadvantage point that we see in many of our societies, this consideration becomes a really important part of how it is that we are moving into the future of many of these conversations. Today, many of us, many of you sitting around this room, look at this very differently than those contexts of 100, 200 years ago. We now see value in culture, in differences, in diversity, in strength, in rights that Indigenous people have and hold and have continued to hold for a very long time period. This is a place that my institution, Yukon College, found itself at just over a decade ago. So again, I mentioned I'm one of 11 self-governing First Nations in our territory, one province territory in Canada. 11 out of our 14 First Nations have self-governing agreements. All 14 First Nations have a legal constitutional right to self-determination. So we saw them approach us. We saw them come to the college. We saw them ask to meet with us and start to have conversation about what's going on. We entered into a summit with them, and they were very frank in their conversation, that they did not feel that we were meeting their needs, that they did not feel that we were meeting the needs of their citizens or their governments in an institution that sits on their traditional territory, that they have been on for time immemorial. It was a tough conversation. It was a lot of thinking to do. It was a lot of back and forth. And I think we've heard many times now, whether it's through things like Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission or other conversations, that education is one of the things that has got us into many of these problems, and education needs to play a role in that path and that journey forward as well. And that in the conversation that we are having in that summit, how is it that we can respond? How is it that we can move forward with these people in mind, with the traditional territories, the Indigenous populations of where we're from? When we left that summit, we had a choice to make as an institution. We could continue on as a post-secondary education provider. We could continue on that path of higher education, speaking that same language, continuing down that typical road. Or we could stop and we could try something different. We could listen. We could look at what we were doing, how we're doing it, why we're doing it, and we could begin something new. That was what we chose. We chose the latter path. This journey has not always been easy. It has been difficult. It has been trying, but it has always been rewarding. And I think that that's one of the huge things to come back to within this. We had to begin a new way of thinking, a new way of moving forward. As a post-secondary institution following a very colonial kind of hierarchy and way of doing things, we're not the holders or the keepers of that information. When we go back to that idea of Indigenous ways of knowing and doing, it's not our job to go forward and bring those to the forefront on our own. What became really important, what became a huge driver in this, was building a relationship. And we had to move forward and we had to build a relationship with our 14 First Nations within the territory. We had to work on that relationship. It's no different than any other relationship we have in life. It's no different than a relationship with our friends, our colleagues, our spouses, our children, our business partners. All of those relationships take work. All of those relationships take time, and they take a constant level of nurturing. This wasn't a one-off. This wasn't a short little while where we have a conversation, we say we're going to do this, and then we forge ahead on our own. This is something that we had to continue and do continue to constantly work on. No different than my marriage, no different than my friendships, no different than any business relationships I may have. I have to put in that time and effort, be honest, be open, and be trusting with this. When we look at the First Nations in the territory, they're not our stakeholders, they're not our user groups, they're not our clients. By and large, they are fundamentally our partners. And we need to look at them and honor them as such. We need to hold them at the same level as what we would the other governments in the territory, other institutions that we work with. And in putting that kind of value into it, in putting that kind of time and effort that we would put into a partnership, we're able to establish something that allows us to make change, that it allows us to move forward, that gives us the permission to be able to do the things that we're doing at the institution. So then what exactly are we doing? So I say 21st century Indigenous ways of knowing and doing across the academy. What do we do at the college then that makes this successful? We've been working at it for a long time. We're going to continue to be working at it. More recently as an institution, we have identified these 5 key areas. And if what we're doing in these areas, which basically encompass everything we do as a post-secondary institute, services, space, governance, programs, policy that informs everything. If we're not looking at those from an Indigenous viewpoint, from a Northern viewpoint, if we aren't including our partners in those conversations from the very beginning, then we're not doing this and we're not doing it right. A couple of quick examples of how we do some of this. Oh, my clicker doesn't want to work. There we go. That I'll share with you. One of them is the President's Advisory Committee on First Nations Initiatives. We have membership from all 14 First Nations in our territory, as well as 3 neighboring. They come to us, to our president, to the highest decision maker within our institution, on a quarterly basis. They come in and they provide us feedback. They provide us information. They provide us needs. We provide them with questions. We provide them with opportunities. We provide them with things that we need their feedback on. And what we have to do when we talk about that idea of relationship is that we have to respond. We have to be open and we have to be honest in what we're doing. And we can't ask them to come in and share with us and not react and not respond to those things. If they're saying that there is something missing in their community, in their education, in their student needs, we need to be able to have an honest conversation about what we can do within that. Ask them what they need. If we can't do it, that is just as important. If it's not something that's in our area of expertise or in our budget or something that we can work on, having that back and forth is as important as being able to say, yes, we can. Because if we just leave things out there hanging in the air, that's not a partnership. If I talk to my husband and tell him we're going to do this, or he asks me to do something and I don't do it, that's a breakdown in our relationship. Just as it would be a breakdown in our relationship with these governments as well. Now, stemming from PACFNI, President's Advisory Committee on First Nations Initiatives, another thing that we've done is we have implemented a core competency within our institution. Whether you are graduating from Yukon College or whether you are working at Yukon College, you must have a core competency on Yukon First Nations. This came as a request from staff, from students. It didn't get built from staff and students. It got built partnering with those nations. It got built with us posing this question out to them and saying, this is an ask. This is what we're wanting. This is what our institution is wanting. How do we do it? This is your history. This is your information. How do we go about this? What are the key points? How should we teach it? What is the pedagogy behind it? What are the outcomes? Who should be able to take this and access it? And building that in partnership with them gives both of us the best possible ability. We can put our name behind that, knowing that it came from the keepers of that information, knowing that it came from those knowledge holders. Had we done it on our own, we wouldn't have a territory looking to take it because that's just Yukon College's information. We can go out and we can say, we built this together with 17 different First Nations. This is the information they want Yukoners to know. This is the information they want future to know. And when we're able to do those things together, we see huge successes happening within our communities, within our college community, within the governments, the infrastructure, all of those pieces within the territory. Those are two quick examples of many, many things that we're doing at the college that highlight this idea of partnership, highlight this idea of having to do this together. This isn't the end of the story for us. This is still very much the beginning. This is a journey forward. This is something that we will continue to work on. We think we're doing a good job. We hear we're doing a good job. It is something that is out there for us in our area, that is out there on a national level in Canada. But this is really the beginning. It doesn't end here. This is that journey. In closing for me, my question out to you folks coming here to listen to this, my challenge out to you folks, is what is it that you're doing in your area? What is it that your organization is doing? How is it that you are acknowledging the Indigenous people on the lands that you're taking up, the space that you're in? What are the ways that you are working together in that? Because I think that is our way forward. That is our way in moving many of these change-making ideas and this bigger social context belief. So in my language, Ganesh Chish. In English, thank you. In the language of the people from here, Ayeya Hun.